The cold metal walls of the Arcturian prison cell seemed to absorb all sound, leaving the air heavy with an oppressive silence. The faint hum of the starship's engines served as a subtle reminder that escape was not merely a matter of courage but an impossibility. Ethan Cole, a field medic from Earth, sat on the floor, his back pressed against the freezing steel. His orange jumpsuit, smeared with blood that wasn't his, clung uncomfortably to his skin. He was used to chaos, to the bloody aftermath of war zones, but this, being a prisoner aboard an alien battleship, was something entirely different. It had been 2 days, or so he estimated, since his capture. The Arcturians had stormed the humanitarian outpost where he'd been stationed, their advanced weaponry overwhelming any resistance within moments. The Arcturians weren't interested in prisoners of war. They sought specimens, tools to be dissected, studied, or otherwise exploited. As the ship's grim reputation suggested, most prisoners didn't leave its cells alive. The metallic clang of boots against the floor snapped Ethan out of his thoughts. He looked up to see 2 Arcturian guards, their sinewy frames armored in black plating, their faces obscured by helmets that glowed faintly at the visors. Without a word, they opened the cell door and gestured for him to rise. When he hesitated, the larger of the 2 stepped forward, grabbing him by the arm and hauling him to his feet. "Where are you taking me?" Ethan demanded, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. The guards didn't answer. Of course, they wouldn't. The Arcturians rarely spoke to their prisoners, considering such interactions beneath them. Ethan was dragged through a series of winding corridors, the walls lined with strange, pulsating conduits that seemed alive. His mind raced. Was this the end? Had they decided he was of no use to them? They stopped before a heavy door reinforced with overlapping plates of metal. One of the guards pressed a sequence on a control panel, and the door slid open with a hiss. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The room beyond was dimly lit, its walls covered in deep gouges and scratches that spoke of violent struggles. The air was thick with the stench of blood and something else, a primal, feral musk that made his stomach tighten. The guards shoved him forward, and he stumbled into the room. Before he could turn back, the door slammed shut, leaving him alone in the suffocating darkness. Alone, except for the low, guttural growl that rumbled from the far end of the cell. Ethan froze. His breath caught in his throat as 2 glowing black eyes pierced the shadows. They were impossibly dark, like twin voids that seemed to draw in the faint light around them. A massive shape shifted in the shadows, stepping into the dim light cast by the room's single, flickering fixture. The creature was enormous, standing at least 6 feet at the shoulder, its jet-black fur rippling with the movements of taut, corded muscles. Its teeth gleamed as it bared them in a snarl, saliva dripping from its fangs. Ethan's legs threatened to give out beneath him, but he forced himself to stand his ground. This was it. The Dominion's famed biological weapon. He'd heard whispers among the other prisoners about a beast, a hybrid monstrosity engineered to be the perfect predator. They called her Fenrix, a name spoken in hushed, terrified tones. The Dominion had created her, and yet they couldn't control her. Rumor had it that she'd killed more Arcturians than any enemy of the Empire ever had. Fenrix began to circle him, her movements slow and deliberate, each step accompanied by the faint click of claws against the floor. Ethan's eyes darted to the gouges on the walls and floor. She could kill him in seconds, tear him apart before he could so much as scream. Yet she hadn't attacked, not yet. Instead, she seemed to be studying him, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to assess the threat he posed. Or perhaps she was savoring the moment. Ethan's training kicked in. Panic wouldn't save him, only clear thinking could. He forced himself to take a slow, steady breath. Animals could sense fear, and whatever Fenrix was, she was still, at least in part, an animal. He raised his hands slowly, palms outward, and avoided making direct eye contact. "Easy," he murmured, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to hurt you." Fenrix paused, her head tilting slightly at the sound of his voice. It was a subtle reaction, but enough to give Ethan hope. He carefully lowered himself to the floor, making himself appear smaller, less threatening. His heart pounded as the wolf-like creature approached, her black eyes locked onto his. When she stopped just a foot away, he could feel the heat radiating off her massive frame. Her growl deepened, a low rumble that resonated in his chest. "You don't want to do this," Ethan continued, keeping his tone steady. "I'm guessing they've hurt you too. I'm not one of them. I want to help." For a moment, nothing happened. Then Fenrix's growl softened, her ears twitching slightly. She took a step back, and Ethan exhaled shakily, realizing he'd been holding his breath. His relief was short-lived, however, as the reality of his situation set in. Even if she didn't kill him immediately, he was still trapped in a cell with a deadly predator and no clear way out. Ethan's eyes roamed the cell, taking in every detail. The walls were reinforced, the doors sealed shut. The only source of light came from the flickering fixture above. In the corner of the room, he spotted a pile of bones, some old, some disturbingly fresh. His stomach churned at the sight, but he forced himself to focus. If there was a way to survive this, he had to find it. Fenrix watched him intently, her massive chest rising and falling with each breath. She seemed hesitant. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, something almost like recognition. It was a strange moment, one that Ethan couldn't fully comprehend. He didn't know what the Arcturians had done to her, what horrors they'd subjected her to, but he could see the pain etched into every scar on her body. "You didn't choose this, did you?" he asked softly, more to himself than to her. Fenrix's ears twitched, and she let out a soft huff, almost like a sigh. Ethan dared to take that as a sign of understanding. Perhaps she wasn't as mindless as the Arcturians believed. Perhaps there was still something beneath the engineered rage, something they hadn't been able to erase. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed outside the cell, drawing Fenrix's attention. Her lips curled back in a silent snarl as she turned toward the door. Ethan's pulse quickened. Whoever was coming, they wouldn't be bringing good news. For the first time, he found himself hoping the predator at his side would see him as an ally, or at least, not as her next meal. The door hissed open, and Ethan braced himself for what came next, his fate now tied to the deadly creature that had spared him, for now. The hiss of the door receding left Ethan and Fenrix exposed to the glare of a broad-shouldered Arcturian. Its translucent armor pulsed faintly in rhythm with its jagged breaths, a subtle reminder of how alive their technology seemed, and how vulnerable Ethan was by comparison. Fenrix had moved to stand between him and the approaching figure, her shoulders coiled with tension, the low growl returning like distant thunder. The Arcturian stopped just inside the threshold, cocking its head as though curious. "You've not killed him," it rasped, its voice mechanical but dripping with contempt. "Intriguing." Ethan's gaze flickered to Fenrix, searching her stance for clues. The black eyes that had moments ago pierced him were now trained on the Arcturian, unreadable and unwavering. It wasn't trust, far from it, but there was a fragile understanding growing. She'd chosen not to kill him before. Maybe she would make the same choice again. He hoped. "She's not a tool for your experiments," Ethan said before his courage could falter. His words earned a slow turn of the Arcturian's head toward him, the faint hum of its armor growing sharper, almost like a warning. The guard's lips pulled into a toothy approximation of a grin. "A pet for the human? Or perhaps you think you're special? You will die as all before you have, but for now, amuse me." With a gesture, it tapped a control embedded on its wrist, sending a spark of electricity coursing through the room. Fenrix flinched, her fur bristling as a low whine of pain escaped her. She scrambled back from the charge as though burned, fixing Ethan with a glint of desperation in her gaze. He clenched his fists. Whatever her strength, the Arcturians had found ways to bend her to their will, ways that filled Ethan with a gnawing unease. Instinct demanded he step between Fenrix and their captor. Logic screamed that this would earn him nothing but injury or worse. In the end, it was neither instinct nor logic that moved him. It was the flicker of defiance in Fenrix's eyes, a momentary light struggling against overwhelming odds. "Enough," he barked, stepping forward. His voice cracked slightly but held. "What do you want from me?" "From her?" The Arcturian raised its wrist, dismissing the energy field with a calculated delay before responding. "We want nothing from you," it replied. only to see how long the prey lasts when paired with the predator. It turned abruptly, exiting as swiftly as it had entered. The door sealed behind it with a finality that felt more damning than any threat spoken aloud. Ethan exhaled shakily, his legs trembling beneath the weight of what had just transpired. But there was no time to process. Fenrix hadn't moved from her huddled position in the corner, her growls quiet but her ears flat against her head. "Hey," Ethan ventured, taking a cautious step toward her. Her gaze snapped to him, sharp and wary, but he refused to retreat. "They hurt you, didn't they? Every time you fight back, they use that thing to make you pay." She didn't respond, at least, not in a way he could easily interpret. But she also didn't lunge at him. Small victories. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, keeping himself deliberately unthreatening. "You're not their weapon," he said softly. "They don't control you, not really. If they did, they wouldn't be testing you on someone like me. They're afraid of you." Fenrix's gaze narrowed, her breathing evening out. Whether his words reached her or not was anyone's guess, but Ethan saw a glimmer of focus returning to her posture. Slowly, she rose, shaking out her fur as though physically discarding the remnants of pain. The gouges on the walls suddenly didn't feel so ominous anymore. If anything, they were proof she had fought back against her tormentors, and won. A thought stirred in Ethan's mind, wild and impossible. Could she help him escape? Was there a chance, no matter how slim, to forge an alliance? "Listen," he said, his tone hushed but urgent. "I know you don't trust me. I wouldn't trust me either. But if we work together, if you help me figure out a way out of here, maybe you can have your revenge. Maybe you can be free." She didn't lunge for his throat, which felt like progress. The silence stretched uncomfortably, the tension in the room growing heavier with each passing second. Then, with a sound that could only be described as a low rumble of consideration, Fenrix stepped closer. It wasn't submission, but it wasn't rejection either. "Good," Ethan muttered, his heart pounding as she sniffed at him cautiously. He held still, barely breathing as her immense jaws lingered uncomfortably close to his throat. Her hot breath brushed against his skin before she pulled away, a grudging tolerance marking her features. He couldn't be sure what had just passed between them, but it felt like the first step toward something fragile yet vital. A loud clatter from the adjacent corridor broke the moment. Fenrix's ears perked instantly, her muscles tightening like coiled springs. Ethan tensed as well, unsure whether to fear more Arcturians or some other engineered nightmare. "This cell won't hold you forever," he whispered, almost more to himself than to her. "And when the time comes, I'm counting on you." She didn't respond, but her gaze lingered on him for a fraction longer than he expected. Whether it was agreement or merely acknowledgement, he couldn't say. The alliance, if it could even be called that, was as fragile as glass. But in this desolate prison, glass was stronger than nothing. Ethan's heartbeat pounded in his ears, syncing with the alarm klaxons blaring through the facility. The chaos outside the cell offered both an opportunity and a grim reminder. Escape wasn't going to be easy, and the cost of failure would be high. Fenrix was already pacing, her movements fluid and deliberate. Whatever tenuous bond they had formed, she seemed to understand that freedom lay just beyond their metal confinement. "Stay close," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. He approached the door, examining the panel with trembling hands. The Arcturians' technology was foreign to him, yet not incomprehensible. They designed this place with arrogance, assuming their prisoners wouldn't have the means, or the wits, to escape. He intended to prove them wrong. Fenrix let out a low rumble, her ears swiveling toward the corridor beyond. The sound of boots striking the metal floor sent a spike of urgency through Ethan. His fingers moved faster, deciphering the glowing symbols that pulsed mockingly. His training as a medic hadn't prepared him for this, but logic and observation were tools he could rely on. Finally, a hiss. The door slid open, revealing a narrow corridor bathed in red emergency lighting. Fenrix shot him a sharp glance, her expression urging him to move. Ethan didn't need convincing. He slipped into the hallway with her shadow close at his heels. The stench of ozone and singed metal filled the air, a testament to the chaos unfolding in other parts of the facility. They darted down the corridor, avoiding open spaces and keeping to the shadows where possible. Fenrix's keen senses proved invaluable. She halted them twice before patrols rounded corners, her acute hearing and nose detecting the Arcturians long before they could be seen. Ethan's trust in her instincts deepened with each narrow escape. They reached an intersection where the corridor split in 3 directions. Ethan hesitated, scanning for clues about which path led to freedom. A guttural growl from Fenrix drew his attention. She was staring down the middle path, her fur bristling. It wasn't a warning of danger but an assertion of certainty. He nodded and followed her lead. The corridor opened into what appeared to be a control room. Transparent screens hovered in mid-air, displaying alien text and schematic diagrams of the facility. 2 Arcturians stood with their backs to the doorway, engrossed in frantic conversation. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat. They hadn't been seen yet, but the moment was fleeting. Fenrix moved first, her massive frame gliding silently across the floor. She leapt with precision, her jaws locking around the throat of the nearest Arcturian before it could react. The second one turned, only for Ethan to tackle it clumsily. The struggle was brief but violent, and Ethan's survival owed more to Fenrix's intervention than his own effort. She dispatched the second guard with brutal efficiency, sparing Ethan from what would have been a losing fight. "Thanks," he muttered breathlessly, wiping blood, not his own, from his hands. Fenrix huffed in response, already scanning the control panels. She'd killed without hesitation, but her focus on the task at hand made it clear that survival, not vengeance, motivated her actions. Ethan's eyes caught a schematic of the facility rotating on one of the screens. A red icon marked their current location, while a blinking green marker labeled Hangar Bay offered a glimmer of hope. He tapped the screen, committing the path to memory. "This way," he said, gesturing to Fenrix. Her ears twitched, signaling her agreement. The journey to the Hangar Bay was fraught with peril. Alarms grew louder as Arcturian forces mobilized, their guttural shouts echoing through the corridors. Ethan and Fenrix moved as one now, a fragile alliance solidified by necessity. Twice they were forced into firefights, Ethan scavenging a weapon from a fallen guard to provide cover while Fenrix tore through their adversaries with calculated ferocity. When they finally reached the Hangar Bay, Ethan's breath caught at the sight before him. Rows of sleek, angular ships filled the cavernous space, their engines humming faintly in readiness. But between them and the closest vessel stood a squad of Arcturians, their weapons raised and glowing ominously. "No turning back now," Ethan said under his breath. He glanced at Fenrix, whose muscles tensed as she crouched low, preparing to strike. "On 3, he whispered. Before he could reach 3, Fenrix launched herself forward, a blur of teeth and claws tearing into the enemy line. Ethan had no choice but to follow, firing the alien weapon with a mix of desperation and determination. The squad fell one by one, their coordination no match for the raw savagery of Fenrix's assault combined with Ethan's unpredictable attacks. As the last Arcturian hit the floor, the hangar fell silent save for the whir of ship engines. Ethan sprinted to the nearest vessel, his hands flying over the controls. Miraculously, the systems responded, either through luck or the Arcturians' underestimation of their captives. Fenrix leapt aboard, her piercing gaze scanning the bay for any signs of reinforcements. "Hold on," Ethan warned as the ship roared to life. He gripped the controls tightly, guiding the vessel out of the hangar and into the abyss of space. The stars stretched out before them, infinite and beckoning. But Ethan's relief was short-lived. A glance at the radar revealed several blips in pursuit. "We're not out of this yet," he said grimly, adjusting the ship's trajectory. Fenrix let out a growl that seemed to say, "I'm ready." The ensuing chase tested every ounce of Ethan's resolve. Dodging plasma fire and weaving through asteroid fields, he relied on equal parts skill and luck to keep them alive. Fenrix stood by his side, an unshakable presence, her eyes fixed on the displays as though understanding the stakes. Finally, with a daring maneuver that left their pursuers careening into an asteroid cluster, Ethan punched the throttle and escaped into uncharted space. The tension in his shoulders eased slightly, though he knew their journey was far from over. He turned to Fenrix, her dark eyes meeting his. For the first time, he saw something beyond the predator. An ally, perhaps even a friend. "We made it," he said softly. Fenrix huffed in response, settling onto the floor of the cockpit. The silence between them was heavy but no longer hostile. They were free, but freedom brought its own uncertainties. Ethan stared out at the stars, a mix of exhaustion and determination filling him. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. He was certain of that much.